Good morning, everybody. Today, what we're going to talk about is 19th century imperialism. So, while democracy is increasing at home in Western Europe, what's really going to happen is it's going to get paid for by imperialism. They go out and they take over and control and basically take advantage of their control over Asia and Africa. And the greatest workers of all of this are the British. And this is really going to be their century as far as all of that is concerned. And we're going to talk about things from 1800 to 1914. So the world is going to be dominated by the West, in particular Western European civilization. And of course, the big question then becomes why the West? Why them? Why did they get to do it? And we'll go over that here in just a minute. So, what are the main causes of imperialism? Well, heck, what is imperialism? Imperialism is the domination of a nation's economic, political, and/or cultural life by another country. Um, and encouraged by their strengths, Europe is going to be the ones, particularly Western Europe, are going to be the nations that are seeking out new empires. Now, this isn't a new idea. They had started this back in the 1500s, but it sort of tapered off in the 1700s. Now it's coming back really strong. And this time, rather than being led by the Spanish, it's led by the British. The same reasons apply. They have economic interests that they're looking out for. They have military interests, political reasons, some humanitarian goals, and this new idea, which is social Darwinism, also known as the white man's burden in some cases. And we're going to talk about each of those things individually. So, economically speaking, empires are good for these industrialized nations because they provide two things: markets and resources. These industrial companies, these big companies that are making tons and tons of goods, they have to have somebody to sell it to. And eventually, they're going to sell whatever it is that they're offering. Let's say it's, I don't know, a washing machine. Most people only have one washing machine in the house, maybe two. Once you've sold washing machines to everybody in your area, you have to find new areas to sell washing machines, or you'll go out of business, right? Or have to stop making washing machines and do something else. So, what they're looking for is new markets to sell their products to. And especially, they're looking at, in this case, two places, India and China. And that's partially because India and China have a lot of people. So they're very, very big markets. Um, the other thing that they're looking to get from colonies is raw materials. Certain raw materials simply won't grow in Western Europe or can't be obtained in Western Europe. Natural rubber. Rubber trees don't, you can't commercially grow rubber trees in Northern or Western Europe. It's too cold. That's a tropical plant. And to get enough of them to make it worth your while, you've got to have lots and lots of them, and that requires tropical climate, and they simply don't have that there. So they've got to go get it somewhere. The only way to really control it is to control the area in which it is, to make sure that you have a supply of whatever it is that you're looking for. So the colonies that they're getting can provide both. And look, this isn't even just a Western European thing. America got in on this as well. Particularly towards the end. At first, the first half of the century, America is too busy with itself. But the last 50 or so years, particularly after the Civil War, the U.S. really gets involved in this, especially the last, 20 years or so of this era, from the mid 1890s until 1914. That's when we really get interested in it. One of the things that we demand is an open door policy in China. And we'll talk a little bit later about how China had sort of been divvied up between various nations. But the U.S. basically said, well, you have to give us access, that we demanded an open door. And that's for that market. There were military interests involved too. Once you start expanding these trades, um, you've got to protect that. And that's going to mean you have to have forts, so you have to have places to put those. It means that you're going to have a bigger navy because your merchant ships are traveling all over the world between your colonies and your home country. By the way, the fancy word for a home country is a metropole. Metropole. The metropole. It's a fancy term for the central leadership of a colonial empire. Anyway, um, so there was the conquest of these colonies that took a military, and then keeping the locals from getting a little bit rowdy, that also required expansion of the military. All of this trade, these ships going all over the place, um, that means that they're going to need a navy to protect them, more of a navy to protect them. Uh, Once you start talking about steam power, especially, which is the middle of this century, uh, that means that you're going to need more naval bases to use as fueling stations. And so you start to see them going for islands in the middle of the Pacific that nobody otherwise would have any interest in because of the need for a place to stop. They got more interested in them and they started to claim, annex, place under their protection, whatever, but basically assume control of uh, little spots all around the world. And the British were especially strong about doing that. Political interests are also a big part of this. It's about prestige. It's about who has the biggest, baddest empire. And to be honest, the British have got a huge head start on that. And to the point that it's literally true when they say that the sun never sets on the British Empire. For a time, that is literally true. As the sun started to go down on one part of the empire, it had already risen on some other part of the empire. There was almost no place on earth at which that was not true. It's huge. It's widespread. And the British, they lord it over, well, pretty much everybody. They've got an attitude about it. Um, there was many a wealthy Englishman who it was inconceivable to them that anyone would dare to harm them or tell them no or deny them anything because they were a I am a British subject, by golly, and if you do anything to me, then Her Majesty will send her armies. And because remember, this is all Victorian era, or almost all, so it would be Her Majesty. Uh, Americans are a lot the same nowadays, and there's places where they love they love our tourist dollars, but they don't really like our tourist attitude. Some places, same idea. We're very arrogant about things like that. The British were, and to a lesser degree still are, but at that point very much were, very arrogant about it because their empire was so big and so strong and so wealthy. Germany, which we just talked about recently getting united, is now looking to start doing this. Now they've got a lot of catching up to do because the British have been at this for 100 years before the German Empire really begins. And so they start to look for, as the Kaiser will put it, Germany's place in the sun. And by that he means tropical colonies. He's literally talking about a place in the sun, not just sort of a metaphorical thing. In order to do that, the Kaiser begins expanding his navy, and you get a naval arms race between particularly Britain and Germany. And Germany's, again, way behind on it, and they never really do catch up. But it's a cause of friction. It is a cause of friction, and it's actually going to be part of what helps to start World War One. For some people, the reason to get involved in an empire, to create an empire, it really was a humanitarian thing. They believed that the things that their civilization could offer these other people would improve their lives immeasurably. And they truly and honestly believed that they would be helpful to others. Now, part of that's very paternalistic, sort of, oh, well, you need us to come in and show you how to do things. But part of it's real, okay? It's not a real popular thing to say these days, but part of it was real. I mean, the fact is, medicine in the West was typically better than what you found most of the places that were being colonized. So the building of hospitals, the building of roads and railroads by engineers. Yes, part of the reason to do that was so that they could exploit the natural resources. Absolutely true. But they they knew that it was also going to be helpful to just the people there. It would help provide jobs and a way to make a living for these people, and improve their lives. Missionaries went all over the world in order to convert people to Christianity. And again, this was obviously not by force. In this case, by that point, that sort of conversion had pretty much gone by the wayside. But to convince people through a variety of means that the Christian faith would save them. And they truly believed that, and they were looking to help people out. Another thing they did was they built schools to partly to help indoctrinate them in Christian values and in the Christian faith, but also as a means of improving the lives of the locals. Now, a lot of locals didn't really like that. Again, that paternalistic attitude of, here, let us give you these things, you poor little benighted soul. Nobody likes to be treated that way. But the fact is that in some ways, the Western civilization did have something that it could provide to these other civilizations to improve them, to make their lives better. And in a way, that's going to tie in with this idea of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is where they took the ideas of Charles Darwin and then applied them to human society. And what Darwin said was that the best adapted creatures will survive and carry on. That gets turned into a saying of survival of the fittest. In other words, the best will prosper. And what that meant to people in societies was that the strongest society, the inherently best society, would be wealthier, mightier, more powerful than lesser civilization societies, whatever you want to say. Okay, so essentially they're saying that Western civilization is inherently superior. It is just part of them that uh, they were better than the peoples of the areas that they were conquering. And in most of the places that they're conquering, of course, the majority of the population is non-white. Okay, so there is a definite race factor involved here. Definitely a race factor involved here. It becomes known somewhat as the white man's burden. And again, that ties in with the humanitarianism. This idea that it was the curse, the burden, the fate of the white man, Western Europeans, to civilize, at least in their eyes, the rest of the world. And by civilize, what we mean, of course, is make them like us. That's what people mean when they say, we're going to civilize you. It means we're going to make you more like we are. Because everyone assumes that their civilization is civilized and that other people's are not, because they're different than ours. And if we're civilized and they're different, obviously they can't be different. Pardon me, they obviously can't be civilized. So hopefully that makes some sense. This concept, it's actually kind of similar to the divine right of kings argument that the absolute monarchs used to use. Well, I'm king because God chose me to be king. Well, we have an empire because we are mighty enough to have an empire. Um, The fact that you have one is justification to have one. The fact that you are king is justification to be king. The fact that you have an empire is justification to be an empire. And it's all sort of a circular logic argument. But for people who are looking for an argument to explain why it's okay, this works out dandy. So that's that's the reasons why they wanted to do it. But how did it work? I mean, for goodness sake, you're talking about sending a couple of thousand soldiers to a place where there are tens of thousands of people and taking them over. How did that happen? How could they have succeeded? And there were a lot of factors involved, but it boils down to relative strengths and weaknesses, okay? Um, Certain places were much less strong than others. The Ottomans, the Mughals of India, the Qing dynasty in China, these are all in decline at this point. And Western Europe has newly industrialized, they've got wealth, they've got a growing population, they have medical and military technologies that are superior to those of the locals in Asia and Africa mostly. And so they use those advantages. One of the big advantages, for example, that the Western civilizations had, and it starts with the British, is a weapon known as the Maxim gun, which is the world's first actual machine gun. It was designed by a fella by the name of Hiram Maxim, who was an American, but he sold it to the British because the U.S. Army wasn't interested in it. It's so important to the ability to conquer these regions that a French poet even wrote a little bit of a poem about how important it was. And in it, it's got a line that says, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." As a guy by the name of Hilaire Belloc. And it's true. That advantage, that advantage of military technology and other military technologies as well, not just the Maxim gun, but the Maxim gun was a big one. It improved the firepower, their ability to fight more people with fewer people so much. It was such a great multiplier for that it allowed them to get away with this sort of thing. And speaking of Hiram Maxim and his machine gun, here it is. Um, that's Hiram Maxim himself, and he's firing his machine gun. This gun is such an effective thing. The design is still in use in some countries over 100 years later, almost 150 years after Hiram Maxim first invented it. It's very reliable. You see that big fat thing on the barrel. That's actually a water jacket that helps keep it cool, and it's belt fed. You can see the little belt of ammunition feeding into the side there. It was fairly lightweight, much lighter than, say, a cannon would have been, and you could move it around with your troops pretty easily. The British bought them. The Germans and the Russians copied the design and developed their own versions, but they were functionally identical. And it was just a heck of a design, and it works as advertised. I mean, that's about all there is to it. Now, of course, there was some resistance to imperialism. Not everybody was a fan of it. Of course, the locals, the natives, did resist, period. Pretty much everywhere, at least for a while. Sometimes by fighting back, almost always unsuccessfully. Remember that, whatever happens, we have got. Others resisted by trying to internally strengthen their own traditions and cultures. Uh, Not resisting necessarily military domination because they figured out pretty quickly that they couldn't, but trying to maintain themselves ethnically and culturally by trying to maintain their traditions. Because when the conquerors came in, when the Europeans came in, for some things they tried to get rid of it. The practice of sati in India, for example, the British worked very hard to stamp that out. which we've discussed before, sati, the burning of the widows on the pyres. Um, but a lot of places, they did their very best to sort of maintain their identities. Um, a lot of places, they organized secret societies, sort of underground communities. I don't mean literally underground, they didn't live like in tunnels like the mole people or anything, but sort of a secret organization dedicated to expelling these imperial powers out of their homes. And probably the most famous two of them are going to be the Mahdists, who follow a religious leader, the Mahdi, and the Boxers over in China. There were even some Europeans and Americans who opposed the idea, partly on moral grounds. It's very hard to say something about, well, we're such a wonderful society. Look how we have expanded democracy and the rights of our peoples, and at the same time be taking away ideas and rights like that from uh, the colonies, these new colonies, and their ability to determine for themselves how they wanted to live. The other big grounds for it, and this is probably actually more common, was economic. They simply didn't want to pay for it. Empires are expensive. You've got to have a much larger army, and those are expensive. You're going to fight wars, those are expensive. You're going to have a big navy, and that's expensive. And all of that means higher taxes because you can't pay for those things without taxes. So a lot of people that were opposed to it in Europe, not all, but many of the people that were opposed, which again is a small percentage, they were opposed to it because they simply didn't want to pay for it. Now, the colonies were all ruled in different ways. They were mostly all militarily conquered, but not always, but usually. But they got ruled in different ways. One of the methods was a direct rule. It's very popular with the French and the Germans. Basically, they show up, they drop off official government officials and soldiers, and they just basically take over governing it. Okay, officials and troops from the parent state administer the colony, just take over. There was an indirect rule colony, more popular with the British, where they kept the local ruler, but that local ruler was basically a puppet. They had European advisors that, well, advisors where they basically told them what to do. Um, but the children then were westernized. They would send the children of the Raja of Lower Nowhereistan to England to be educated as a child, as a young man. And then he would, of course, pick up English manners and customs and make friends with English lords and things. And he would come back and he would be very English, Anglo-Indian. Um, and so then the next generation, they're much more closely tied to England. And you keep doing that, and they become more and more British, okay, or Western. There's protectorates where you have the local rulers left in place, and they're more independent, but you still, when the local advisor, uh, the ambassador from, let's say, England again, says, Your Majesty, I believe it would be in everyone's best interest if we were to do this, that, or the other, then the local Raja or whatever um, would think for a moment and then agree. So that's a protectorate. And then there's the sphere of influence, very popular with America. This is a region where an outside power claims basically exclusive trading rights. Because you control their international trade, that gives you a lot of influence over them economically. And of course, we all know that that means that you have a lot of influence politically as well. Um, Several European nations did this in China. We'll talk about the carving up of China later. And the U.S. does it strongly in Latin America, and it's part of the reason why so many Latin American countries don't like us all that much. So let's get down to a little bit more specific stuff. And we're going to start off with what happened in Africa. In the early 1800s, Northern Africa was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. It was ruled very loosely, but it was, at least theoretically and technically, ruled by the Ottomans. Western Africa had developed a bunch of new kingdoms, relatively small. Some were Muslim fundamentalist states, others, like the Ashanti, were not. But this West African slave trade is going to diminish somewhat when the British unilaterally outlaw it. They decide that they don't want to have slaves coming out of Western Africa anymore, and so they say you can't do it, and then they shut it down using their navy. Eastern Africa, however, continued. The tribal units and kingdoms of Eastern Africa continued to sell slaves to the Muslims further north. Southern Africa is dominated by the Zulu kingdom of natives, the Zulu nation, and the Boers, who were the Dutch farmers who had settled there when the Cape Colony was a Dutch colony. And the Boers and the Zulus, they don't much like each other. They've spent, well, pretty much the last couple of hundred years fighting one another. And like I said, they just don't really care much for each other. Now the Boers will become ruled by the British, and they don't like that either, and that's going to lead to problems. So as the century progresses, there's more and more contact with Europeans. We've got explorers going into Africa to seeking the sources of certain rivers. David Livingstone went to look for the Zambezi River, the source of the Zambezi River, and found it. And Richard Burton and a colleague of his named Speke, Speke, explored looking for the Nile's source, and Speke and Burton actually find it. And then they argue over who they were friends, and they end up arguing and fighting over who actually found it. They claim it was two different places. And anyway, it was pretty ugly, actually. Burton wins the argument. Richard Burton's a really interesting fellow. I don't mean the actor. I know the actor is kind of too, but this is Sir Richard Burton, the first kind of Sir Richard Burton, who discovered the source of the Nile. Dr. Livingstone is probably, David Livingstone was a doctor, by the way. He's probably most famous for the fact that he got lost. He was gone so long exploring that a newspaper actually sent someone to go find him. They sent a rescue expedition led by a fellow named Stanley. And when he found Livingstone, supposedly he walked up to him and said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," and probably in something like that voice, except much, much better because he actually was British. Anyway, so and that sort of becomes this famous line of discovering this guy, kind of almost by accident. Even though, I mean, he was out there looking for him, I think he was surprised when he actually found him and he was alive. Another kind of contact that is increasing during this time is the number of missionaries and mission societies of various Christian sects that start springing up. I mean, the Lutherans send people, the Unitarians send people, the Catholics do, the Methodists do. I don't know if the Baptists were sending out many yet at that point or not, to be honest. I know that the Presbyterians did some. Church of England, not so much, a little bit, but more Methodists coming out of England at that point as missionaries. Anyway, you get the idea. Lots and lots of different kinds of Christianity sent these guys out. They built schools. They built hospitals. These are good things, right? I mean, most of us would agree that an area with a school and a hospital is an area that's better off than it was before. The flip side of that, though, is that they were often paternalistic and condescending, which doesn't make nice with the locals, really. And so they start scrambling for colonies. And rather than fight wars over who gets what they decided to do was the Kaiser invited the heads of several of the major European nations, or at least their representatives, to Berlin, and they have a conference in 1884. Now, some of the uh, colonies in Africa already existed, South Africa, for example. Um, but what they've decided is that they will decide who gets what in Africa, and they start carving it up in the Berlin Conference of 1884. Um, and essentially, within 20 years, all of Africa comes under European dominance, except for two places: Ethiopia over in East Africa and Liberia in West Africa. Liberia is essentially an American colony. It was created by the United States as a place for emancipated slaves to go back in the 1820s, and it was never a terribly successful place, but it was technically not technically a colony. It was a protectorate. They had their own rulers and such, but they certainly followed the U.S. lead. Another piece that was not part of the Berlin Conference of 1884 is the Congo Free State, which was anything but free. It's the personal property of Leopold II, King of Belgium. It did not belong to the nation of Belgium. It belonged to Leopold personally. Just like I own my home, he owned the Congo, okay, and everything in it, theoretically. It is an example of the absolute worst of colonial imperialism. The locals were literally tortured, ruthlessly exploited the place for gold and ivory, and they just looted the country. Rubber was another big thing that they got out of there, but they just looted the joint and treated the natives with extreme cruelty. Um, the kind of thing that would make people who thought little of the treatment of the American Indians look and say, gosh, those guys are barbarians, right? It was pretty bad. And here we have a great political cartoon. You know how much I like my political cartoons. It's a great little political cartoon. It's a French cartoon of Bismarck, who was still the Chancellor of Germany, and the rulers of other nations, the heads of other states, as they carve up Africa to their liking. So Bismarck has got the knife, and they're chopping Africa. That's what Afrika means. Into pieces, and everybody's going to get their various slices. And here you see the result. Now, while Britain has the most colonies, Britain has the red, the British colonies are there in red. While Britain has the most colonies, the nation with the largest area is actually France, and that's because they have all of that French West Africa and Algeria, and through there, the French equatorial area through there, that they've taken over. And while a lot of that is desert, and nobody really cares for it, there's along the coasts and places, there's some quality real estate there. Um, they also controlled Madagascar for a good while. So did Spain later. Anyway, the Germans, they've got a few colonies, not a whole lot. The Italians are there, and the Portuguese have Angola. Belgium, there's the Belgian Congo, the Belgian Free State there, which just barely gets out to the ocean, and there's how they carved everything up. I would take a moment or two to look it all over. Just a hint. I'm going to start this slide off by telling you that the code word is red. The code word is red. You need to remember that, guys. All right. Other African colonies, like I just mentioned, France has the biggest area. Algeria, Tunisia, the big chunks of West and Central Africa. How influential was it? Well, there are still African nations that use French as an official language. Togo, among others. I know a little bit about Togo because my cousin was a member of the Peace Corps once upon a time, and she went there and lived there for a few years. And one of the reasons she went there was because she speaks French. Anyway, Great Britain had smaller and more scattered colonies than the French colonies, but they had some very valuable ones. They had Egypt, which meant that they got control of the Suez Canal, which meant they controlled basically passage through it to their profit, and South Africa, where they're going to find both gold and diamonds later on. So massively wealth producing there for a bit. The British are gonna fight several wars down there over control of southern Africa. The most famous is probably actually the Anglo-Zulu War, the Zulu Wars in the late 1870s. There have been movies made about these battles, and it's fairly classic of the genre, the type of wars that were fought, where heavily outnumbered Europeans are attacked by technologically inferior but numerically superior natives. And yet, in some cases, and in many cases, the heavily outnumbered Europeans win. And the most famous battle of it all is probably a place called Rorke's Drift, Rorke''S Drift, where a small number of British soldiers held off a huge number of Zulu warriors. And then the two Anglo-Boer Wars, which were between the English and the Dutch Boers in South Africa.
You think the Welsh can't do better than that, Owen?
Well, they've got a very good base section, mine. But no top tenors, that's for sure. Stop your dreaming. Can't you see their spear points gleaming? See their warrior pennons streaming to this battlefield.
Sing!
Men of Alex, stand ye steady.
Come on, sing!
Cannot be ever said ye. For the battle we are ready.
Stand ye steady, if thou not be.
At 100 yards, volley fire, present! Aim! Fire!
All right, stand by. Squire. Sergeant.
Prepare!
Spit, boy, spit!
Enough money! Fire! Volley fire, right! Front bang! Fire! Fire!